I knew the moment my son cleared his throat at the head of the boardroom table that something was about to change, and not in a way he expected me to like. The conference room on the 23rd floor had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Chicago, the morning sun reflecting off glass towers and Lake Michigan in the distance, the same view I had looked at for more than 30 years since the day Whitmore Logistics first moved into this building. 12 board members sat around the long walnut table, their coffee cups still steaming, tablets glowing softly in front of them. My son, Daniel Whitmore, stood beside the presentation screen in a tailored navy suit, confident, polished, looking every bit like the modern CEO the business magazines liked to photograph. He clicked the remote in his hand and a new slide appeared. Leadership Transition Plan. I noticed something else immediately. My name was on the slide, but not where it used to be. Not at the top. Not even in the middle. It sat at the bottom corner in small gray letters, under a heading labeled Advisory Role. For a moment I thought I had read it wrong. 30 years of building a company from a rented warehouse on the south side, 30 years of negotiating contracts, hiring drivers, surviving recessions and fuel crises, and now my name looked like a footnote. Daniel began speaking in the calm, professional tone executives use when they believe everyone already agrees with them. He talked about market changes, digital transformation, the need for fresh strategic leadership. He spoke the language consultants like to charge thousands of dollars to repeat. A few board members nodded slowly. Others stared at the slide, then glanced toward me and quickly looked away. Daniel paused and smiled politely, the kind of smile you give before delivering a line you've rehearsed many times. My mother built this company, he said, gesturing toward me as if introducing a guest at a dinner party. And we all respect that legacy. But the transportation industry is evolving quickly, and the company needs leadership that reflects the future. The room grew quiet. No one interrupted him. No one defended me either. I folded my hands on top of my leather notebook and listened. I had heard that tone before. Not from Daniel when he was younger, but from people who thought experience had an expiration date. He clicked to the next slide. Charts. Growth projections. A timeline that ended with one sentence in bold letters, CEO transition, effective this quarter. That was when I realized this presentation wasn't just a discussion. It was a plan. And according to my own son, the future of the company I created apparently didn't include me at the table where it all began. Daniel continued speaking as if the slide behind him had already settled the matter. He walked slowly along the side of the table, the remote control still in his hand, explaining numbers that everyone in the room already understood. Revenue growth over the last 5 years. Expansion into 3 new distribution hubs. A modernization plan that sounded impressive until I remembered that most of those projects had started long before he became Chief Executive Officer. The board members listened carefully. Some of them nodded. Others kept their faces neutral, the way people do when they do not want to choose sides too early. I looked around the table and recognized nearly every face. Thomas Avery had joined the board 20 years ago when we opened our first regional terminal in Indiana. Linda Parker had helped negotiate our first national shipping contract. These were people who had watched my son grow up running through our old warehouse with a toy truck in his hands. Now they sat silently while he explained why the company no longer needed the woman who built it. Daniel stopped beside the screen and folded his hands. His voice softened slightly, as if he believed kindness would make the message easier to accept. He said the company still valued my wisdom and experience. He said the board would welcome my guidance as a strategic advisor. The words sounded respectful, but the meaning was clear. Advisor meant spectator. Advisor meant the person who built the house could watch from the porch while someone else moved the furniture inside. A few people shifted in their chairs. One director adjusted his glasses and studied the presentation again, as if hoping the numbers would explain the situation for him. Another cleared his throat but said nothing. I noticed something else as Daniel spoke. The language on the slides did not sound like him. Daniel had always been direct. Practical. The phrases on the screen were polished in a different way, the sort of corporate vocabulary that came from consultants or public relations teams. Strategic repositioning. Leadership renewal. Future-focused governance. I had heard those expressions recently in another place. At dinner a few weeks earlier, my daughter-in-law Claire had mentioned that companies needed to reinvent themselves to stay competitive. She had said it casually while pouring wine, but the phrasing had been almost identical. The thought lingered in my mind while Daniel continued presenting charts and timelines that stretched across the next 12 months. According to the schedule he had prepared, the leadership transition would begin immediately and conclude before the end of the fiscal year. My role during that time would slowly fade into the background. No dramatic announcement. No confrontation. Just a quiet reshaping of the company structure until the founder no longer occupied a seat at the center of the table. Daniel finally paused and looked around the room, clearly expecting agreement. For a moment no one spoke. The only sound was the low hum of the air conditioning above us and the distant traffic far below the windows. Then he turned toward me with the same polite smile he had used since the meeting began. It was the smile of a man who believed the outcome had already been decided. And that was the moment I understood something important. My son thought he was presenting the future of Whitmore Logistics. What he did not realize was that he had just revealed how little he truly understood about the company his mother built. Daniel waited for someone to respond to his presentation, but the boardroom remained quiet. I could feel the tension moving slowly around the table like a draft through a closed room. Thomas Avery finally leaned back in his chair and looked at the screen again, his eyes narrowing slightly as if he were studying something that did not quite add up. Linda Parker tapped the side of her tablet with a pen, then glanced toward me for a moment before lowering her eyes again. I did not blame them for their silence. Boardrooms have a strange kind of gravity. People rarely speak first when a decision appears to have already been framed. Daniel seemed comfortable in that silence. He straightened his jacket and continued explaining the timeline as though the meeting were simply a formality. According to his proposal, my transition into an advisory position would begin immediately. Over the next 3 months, most executive responsibilities would shift entirely to him. By the end of the year, the company would officially operate under what he called a modernized leadership structure. The words sounded carefully prepared, almost rehearsed. I watched him closely while he spoke. Daniel had always been confident, even as a child, but there was something different about the way he delivered this presentation. His tone carried the certainty of someone who believed the room had already agreed with him long before the meeting began. That confidence did not come from nowhere. People only speak that way when they think the numbers are already on their side. I glanced around the table again, slowly, without turning my head too obviously. Most of the board members were looking at Daniel, but a few of them looked uneasy. One man rubbed his chin thoughtfully while reading the printed agenda. Another woman shifted in her chair and quietly closed the folder in front of her. They were listening, but they were not celebrating. That told me something important. The room had not fully decided yet. Daniel finished describing the final stage of the transition and placed the remote control on the table. Then he folded his hands and looked toward me again. The smile he gave me this time was smaller, almost cautious, as if he were waiting to see how I would react in front of everyone. For a moment I simply looked at the slide behind him. Leadership Transition Plan. My name still sat in the lower corner of the screen like a small historical note. I reached for my notebook and slowly closed it. The sound of the leather cover snapping shut was soft, but in the quiet room it seemed to echo across the table. Then I stood up. A few people shifted in their seats as if expecting an argument or a long explanation. Instead I simply smoothed the sleeve of my jacket and looked at Daniel. He had grown taller than me years ago, but in that moment he looked strangely young again, like the boy who used to sit in my office after school while I finished paperwork. I gave him a small, calm nod. If that is the direction the board believes is best for the company, I said, then I trust you will all make the decision you feel is right. My voice sounded steady, even to my own ears. No one spoke. I picked up my notebook, walked to the door, and left the boardroom without another word. Behind me the meeting continued, but I did not stay to hear the rest. The hallway outside was quiet and bright with afternoon light from the windows. As I walked toward the elevator, one thought settled firmly in my mind. My son believed he had just taken control of the future. What he did not realize was that the future of this company had been written long before that meeting ever began. I walked slowly down the hallway toward the elevator, the sound of my heels against the marble floor echoing more loudly than usual in the quiet afternoon. The 23rd floor had always been the executive level of Whitmore Logistics, but I remembered when this entire company fit inside a single rented warehouse that smelled like diesel fuel and cardboard boxes. Back then there were no polished floors, no glass conference rooms, and certainly no board meetings about replacing the founder. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime and I stepped inside alone. As the doors closed, the tension from the meeting began to settle into something calmer, something colder. I was not surprised by what had happened in that boardroom. Disappointed, perhaps, but not surprised. Over the past year I had noticed small changes in Daniel. He spoke differently in meetings. He used phrases that sounded borrowed from someone else. Words like strategic repositioning and leadership renewal had started appearing in his presentations, and every time I heard them I remembered another voice saying almost the same thing across our dinner table at home. Claire had always been ambitious. From the moment she married Daniel she made it clear she believed the company should grow faster, expand further, modernize every department at once. She often said that businesses needed bold decisions and younger leadership. At the time I had simply smiled and passed the bread basket across the table. When the elevator reached the lobby I stepped out and walked through the glass doors into the parking garage. The late afternoon air carried the faint smell of rain, and the sky above Chicago was turning the pale gray that usually meant a storm would arrive by evening. I sat in my car for a moment without starting the engine and looked up at the building where my company had operated for 3 decades. Daniel believed today had been a turning point. He believed the board had watched him present a confident plan for the future. What he did not know was that I had been quietly studying every change in the company for months. I had seen the way certain board members suddenly supported his proposals without asking many questions. I had noticed the new consulting firm he hired last winter. And I had also noticed something far more important than any presentation slide. Daniel had been focusing on titles and schedules and appearances, but he had never once asked me about the original charter of Whitmore Logistics. He had never asked why certain clauses existed in the founding documents or why my name remained on several pages that most executives rarely bothered to read. When my husband and I created the company 30 years ago, we did not just build warehouses and trucking routes. We built rules to protect the company when leadership changed or when unexpected problems appeared. Some of those rules were simple. Others were written very carefully by lawyers who understood how businesses survive difficult moments. As the first drops of rain began tapping against the windshield, I finally started the car. I drove back toward the office instead of heading home. The building was quieter by the time I returned, and most employees had already left for the evening. I took the elevator back up to my old office and unlocked the door. The room still smelled faintly of coffee and paper, exactly the way it always had. On the bookshelf beside my desk sat a thick leather binder that had not moved in years. I pulled it down and placed it carefully on the desk. The words on the front were simple. Whitmore Logistics Corporate Charter. I opened the binder slowly and began turning the pages one by one, reading each line the way I had the day it was first signed. Somewhere in those pages was a detail my son had forgotten to consider, and by the time I reached the final section of the document the quiet office felt very different from the boardroom he had left behind. I sat at my desk with the leather binder open in front of me, the soft yellow light of the desk lamp falling across pages that had not been studied carefully in many years. Outside the window the rain had started to fall steadily over Chicago, turning the glass into a blur of silver lines. I turned another page slowly, remembering the afternoon when my late husband and I first signed these documents with a lawyer who believed in planning for every possible future. Back then we had only 12 trucks, one warehouse, and more ambition than money, but we knew something important. Companies grow. Leadership changes. People sometimes forget where power actually lives. That was why we wrote the charter carefully, clause by clause, line by line. Most executives only read the sections that describe titles and responsibilities. Very few read the final pages where the real safeguards are written. I continued scanning the text until my finger paused on a paragraph I had not needed to use in decades. The language was simple, but the meaning was unmistakable. The founding shareholder retained a final veto authority over executive leadership decisions if those decisions threatened the stability of the company. I leaned back slightly in my chair and read the sentence again, not because I had forgotten it, but because I wanted to feel the weight of it after all these years. When Daniel presented his transition plan in the boardroom earlier that day, he had spoken as if authority moved automatically with the title of Chief Executive Officer. What he had forgotten was that titles are temporary. Ownership is not. The rain against the windows grew heavier while the office remained quiet. Most of the building had already emptied for the evening, leaving only the distant hum of elevators and the occasional echo of footsteps from a security guard making his rounds. I closed the binder gently and rested both hands on the cover. Daniel had not always been this confident, this certain that the future belonged entirely to him. I remembered the first time he visited our old warehouse as a boy, standing beside me while trucks backed into loading docks and drivers shouted greetings across the yard. He used to ask endless questions about how shipments moved from one state to another. Back then he believed the company was something we built together as a family. Somewhere along the way that idea had changed. Perhaps it changed slowly when new consultants arrived and began filling meetings with complicated language. Perhaps it changed when Claire started speaking about expansion and modernization as if the past were something inconvenient. Whatever the reason, Daniel now believed the company needed to move beyond the woman who created it. I stood up from the desk and walked toward the window, watching the rain run down the glass in quiet streams. The city lights below reflected across the wet streets like scattered gold. Tomorrow the board would return to the office expecting the normal rhythm of business. Daniel would likely assume the transition plan had already begun moving forward. But plans only work when every rule has been considered. I turned back toward the desk and picked up the binder again. The clause about veto authority was still exactly where I remembered it. Clear. Legally binding. Impossible to ignore once someone decided to use it. I placed the binder inside my briefcase and switched off the desk lamp. As I stepped into the darkened hallway outside my office, one thought remained steady in my mind. Daniel had prepared a presentation about the future of Whitmore Logistics. Tomorrow morning I would remind him that the foundation of that future had been written long before his presentation ever appeared on a screen. I left the building shortly after 9 that evening with the leather binder resting inside my briefcase, the rain finally slowing to a quiet drizzle over the streets of Chicago. The city looked different at night, calmer and almost reflective, as if even the traffic understood that the day had already said everything it needed to say. During the drive home I thought about the boardroom again, about the way Daniel had stood beside the presentation screen with the confidence of someone who believed the future had already been arranged in his favor. Confidence can be a powerful thing in business, but it can also become a blind spot when it grows too comfortable. Daniel had spent months preparing slides, projections, and timelines. He had clearly spoken with several board members ahead of the meeting, carefully shaping the narrative of progress and modernization. Yet in all that preparation he had overlooked something much older than any spreadsheet or consulting report. When I arrived home the house was quiet, the kind of silence that comes after a long day when everyone else has already gone to sleep. I set my briefcase on the kitchen table and poured a glass of water, standing for a moment beside the window that looked out over the dark street. Daniel and Claire lived only a few miles away, in a newer neighborhood filled with modern houses and perfectly trimmed lawns. They believed the company represented the next stage of their lives, something they could shape according to their own ideas of growth and ambition. I did not resent that ambition. Every company needs people who believe in expansion and new possibilities. What concerned me was the assumption that experience had suddenly become an obstacle instead of a foundation. I carried the briefcase into my study and placed it on the desk where I had once reviewed contracts late into the night during the early years of the company. The binder remained inside, unopened now, because I had already found the line that mattered. Founder Veto Authority. 3 simple words that rarely appear in business magazines yet carry more weight than most executive titles. I sat down in the chair and thought carefully about the next step. Using that clause was not something to do impulsively. It existed for moments when leadership decisions threatened the stability of the company itself. That was why my husband insisted it be included decades ago. He used to say that people change when power arrives too quickly, and sometimes a company needs a quiet safeguard to protect what took years to build. I looked at the clock on the wall. It was almost 10:30. The board members would be reviewing Daniel's presentation tonight, discussing it privately with one another, perhaps even congratulating him for having the courage to push the company forward. By morning they would expect the transition plan to begin moving quietly into motion. Instead, tomorrow morning would begin differently. I opened my laptop and drafted a short message to the board secretary requesting an emergency meeting at 8:30 sharp. The wording was simple and professional, the kind that raises curiosity without revealing the entire purpose. I closed the laptop and finally allowed myself a small breath of relief. Daniel believed the boardroom yesterday had been the first step toward replacing the founder. What he did not understand yet was that tomorrow morning the same boardroom would reveal something he had completely forgotten to consider when he wrote his presentation. The next morning the sky over Chicago was clear again, the storm from the night before leaving the streets washed clean and the air unusually calm. I arrived at the office earlier than usual, just after 7:30, when most of the building was still quiet and the elevators moved slowly between nearly empty floors. The security guard at the front desk greeted me with the same respectful nod he had used for years, and I returned it before stepping into the elevator. As the doors closed and the numbers climbed toward the executive floor, I felt none of the tension that had filled the boardroom the previous afternoon. The leather briefcase in my hand was not heavy, but the binder inside carried 3 decades of decisions, promises, and carefully written safeguards. When the elevator doors opened on the 23rd floor, the hallway lights were already on, though the offices were mostly dark. I walked past the glass conference rooms and paused briefly outside the boardroom door. Through the glass wall I could see the long walnut table, the presentation screen, and the chairs where the directors had sat the day before while my son confidently explained the future of the company. Everything looked exactly the same. The only difference was that this morning the meeting had been called by me. By 8:15 the first board members began arriving. Thomas Avery entered with his usual quiet manner, carrying a folder under his arm. He looked slightly surprised to see me standing beside the window, but he offered a polite smile and asked if everything was all right. I told him calmly that I simply wanted to clarify a few points from yesterday's discussion. Linda Parker arrived a few minutes later, followed by 2 other directors who greeted one another with low voices as they took their seats around the table. The atmosphere in the room was different from the previous meeting. There was curiosity in the air, the kind that appears when people know something unexpected is about to happen but cannot yet identify what it is. Daniel walked in at 8:25, still confident, still carrying the same polished composure he had displayed during his presentation. He nodded politely toward the board members and then looked at me with a small, puzzled smile. Perhaps he believed this meeting was simply a continuation of the transition plan he had already introduced. Perhaps he thought I had finally decided to accept the advisory role he described so carefully the day before. Claire was not present, but for a brief moment I remembered the way she used to speak about modern leadership over dinner. Daniel placed his tablet on the table and sat down at the head of the boardroom, exactly where he had stood during his presentation. The directors settled into their chairs as the clock on the wall moved closer to 8:30. I opened my briefcase slowly and placed the leather binder on the table in front of me. The sound of it touching the polished wood was quiet, but several people glanced down at it immediately. Daniel noticed it as well, his expression shifting from casual confidence to mild curiosity. I did not rush. I simply opened the binder to the page I had already marked the night before and waited for the room to grow completely silent. Outside the windows the morning traffic had begun moving across the city, but inside the boardroom every chair had turned slightly in my direction. Daniel believed yesterday had been the moment he claimed control of the company's future. What he did not realize yet was that the most important decision about that future had been written into this binder long before he ever prepared his presentation.